The mules had planted their hooves in the Nevada mud like they meant to grow roots there, and Lydia Hart was fairly certain that Jasper, the elder of the pair, was doing it out of pure spite. "Move," she said, hauling on the traces with both hands, her boots sinking past the ankle in the brown slop that had once been a perfectly passable crossing at Willow Wash. "I have a boy with a broken arm waiting on me in Copper Flat, and I will not spend my afternoon arguing philosophy with a mule." Jasper flicked his ears and did not move. Moses, the younger mule, seemed content to follow his elder's example, and together they stood hitched to a wagon that had sunk to its axle in a stretch of mud left behind by a hard rain 3 days past. The rest of the district had dried out under a string of fair, bright days, but this low crossing held water like a stubborn memory, and Lydia's wagon had found the one soft place in 10 miles of otherwise solid road. She had already tried a fence rail wedged beneath the wheel as a lever, had already unhitched and rehitched the team twice, had already spoken to those mules in tones ranging from reasonable to threatening, and had accomplished nothing but the ruin of her second-best boots. She was bent low, shoulder against the wheel, skirts hiked and pinned with more concern for leverage than modesty, when she heard the creak of a wagon and the low, unhurried voice of a man. "Ma'am, you look like you are having a conversation with that wheel, and the wheel is winning." Lydia straightened, pushed a loose strand of dark hair from her eyes with the back of a muddy wrist, and turned to find a big man sitting easy atop a buckboard loaded with iron bar stock and coils of chain, a heavy-shouldered bay gelding in the traces. He wore a leather apron rolled down around his waist, the sleeves of his shirt pushed up over forearms that had clearly spent years near a forge, and he was looking at her with an expression that held no mockery at all, only a kind of patient interest. "I am having a conversation with the mud," she said. "The wheel is merely caught in the middle of it, same as I am." "Well." He set the brake on his own wagon and climbed down without being asked, which struck her as either presumptuous or practical, and she had not yet decided which. "I have pulled wagons out of that hole before. It is deeper than it looks and it does not let go easy." "I am aware of that, sir. I have been acquainted with it for the better part of an hour." "Theodore Boone," he said, by way of introduction, extending a hand before seeming to remember it was covered in the day's soot and offering a small, rueful smile instead. "I keep the smithy in Silver Creek." Lydia Hart. She did not offer her hand either, given the state of her own gloves, but she inclined her head. "I am the district physician, such as the district has one, and I am late to a house call, Mr. Boone, so if you have some notion of getting these animals moving, I would be glad to hear it rather than exchange names at leisure." That earned her a genuine laugh, short and warm, and it changed his whole face. "Fair enough, Dr. Hart. Let me look at your wheel." He did not simply look. He walked the length of her wagon, crouched at the rear axle, put 2 fingers against the hub, and studied the angle of the sunken wheel the way she imagined he studied a piece of iron before he decided how to bend it. Then he went to his own wagon, uncoiled a length of rope thick as her thumb, and looped it with quick, sure hands around the sunk wheel's rim, and then around a stout cottonwood standing at the edge of the wash. "You mean to pull it out sideways," Lydia said, understanding at once, "not forward against the suction." He glanced at her, surprised, and something in his face rearranged itself into respect. "That is exactly what I mean to do. Most folks try to drive straight out and only dig the hole deeper. I considered it. I did not have a rope long enough, nor a tree conveniently placed." "You considered it correctly, then. You were only short on tools." He said it without condescension, as a simple statement of fact, and Lydia found she liked him rather more for saying it that way than she expected to. He hitched his own gelding to the rope in tandem with her mule's, then walked to Jasper's head and took the bridle himself. "Mr. Boone, that animal does not respond to strangers." "Ma'am, animals mostly respond to a fellow who is not afraid of them and is not in a hurry, and I have got plenty of neither this afternoon." He leaned close to the mule's ear and said something too low for Lydia to catch, and Jasper's ears came forward, alert instead of pinned back, and when Theodore Boone clicked his tongue and stepped forward, the mule stepped with him. It took the combined strength of 3 animals, and Boone's shoulder set hard against the wagon bed, and it took Lydia herself heaving on the wheel spokes at his direction, her boots lost entirely somewhere in the mud beneath her, before the wagon gave a great sucking groan and lurched free onto solid ground. She staggered, and his hand caught her elbow before she went down, steady and sure, and for one moment she was very aware of how close he stood and how the whole disaster of her afternoon had, in the space of 20 minutes, resolved itself into something almost pleasant. "There," he said, releasing her arm the instant she had her feet under her, which she noted and appreciated. "Free and clear. I am obliged to you, Mr. Boone." She looked down at herself, at the ruin of her dress and the mud drying stiff on her forearms, and could not entirely suppress a laugh. "Though I fear I owe my patience an apology for my appearance as much as I owe you my thanks. I expect a boy with a broken arm will forgive a muddy doctor faster than a clean one who arrived late." He was already coiling his rope, unhurried, and she saw that his own wagon and its cargo of iron would put him well behind schedule for whatever business had brought him out this road. Copper Flat is a fair piece yet, and that wash back at Bitter Creek washed out its plank crossing 2 days past. You will want to take the high trail around, not the low ford. I had planned to take the low ford. You would have found 6 feet of water where a road used to be. He said it simply, no boast in it, only the flat certainty of a man who knew the ground. I drove freight on this road for the stage line before I hung up my whip for a hammer, Dr. Hart. I know every mile of it and most of its bad tempers besides. She studied him a moment, reassessing. "Then I am obliged to you twice over, once for the wheel and once for keeping me out of a river. I could ride with you as far as the fork if it would ease your mind. I am headed to Copper Flat myself, to deliver hinges to the mill office, and 2 wagons are safer than one on that stretch, mud or no mud." It was, Lydia thought, entirely unnecessary. She had traveled this district alone for a year and more, since long before her husband died and long after, and she had managed. But there was something in the plain, unpressing way he offered it, no more freighted than an observation about the weather, that made refusal feel like a kind of foolish pride rather than good sense. "I would not want to trouble you out of your way, Mr. Boone." "It is not out of my way. It is entirely my way. I only added the offer of company to it." A corner of his mouth lifted. "But I take your meaning, ma'am, and I will not press. A woman who can spot a lever problem in a stuck wheel does not need a stranger fussing over her safety." Something about being seen so clearly, and so quickly, loosened something in Lydia's chest that she had not realized was tight. "Ride with me to the fork, then," she said. "I would be glad of the company if I am honest, and gladder still of a guide who knows which fords are lying to me." They traveled the next 6 miles together, her wagon and his rattling along in easy tandem, and somewhere in that distance she learned that he had built his forge with his father 12 years before, that his father had died of a fever the winter before last, that Theodore Boone had stayed in Silver Creek, not because there was nowhere else to go, but because a district that depended on one road and one mill and precious little water needed a man who could shoe a horse and mend a wagon wheel and fix whatever iron thing broke on any given week, and somebody had to be that man. "And you," he said, as they neared the fork in the road where their paths would separate, "you are the district physician. I do not recall Silver Creek keeping one before." "Silver Creek has not kept one for longer than a season in 10 years, Lydia said. "My husband was persuaded to come out from Sacramento with promises of a fine practice and a grateful community, and what he found instead was 3 mining camps, 1 failing farm settlement, and roads that flood every spring and freeze every winter. He died of a fever he caught tending a boy with the same complaint. 18 months passed. I stayed. Most widows would have gone home." Most widows did not spend 4 years reading medicine over their husband's shoulder and learning to set bones and stitch wounds themselves. She said it without bitterness, only a plain accounting of fact, the same tone he had used about his own father. Somebody has to be the doctor here too, Mr. Boone. It seems we are both in the business of being the person who stayed. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and something passed between them that neither of them named, and then he touched his hat brim. I am glad of it, Dr. Hart. Silver Creek is lucky to have you, mud and all. She laughed, and it startled her how easily it came. I will remember you said that the next time I am stranded up to my knees. You do that. I am not hard to find. Follow the sound of the hammer. She watched him turn his wagon down the southern fork toward Copper Flat, and told herself firmly that the warmth in her chest was nothing more than relief at being freed from the mud, and knew even as she told herself so that it was not entirely true. Silver Creek in the spring of 1879 was not much to look at, and Lydia had long since stopped expecting it to be. It sat in a fold of dry hills where a creek ran silver-bright with mica in the springtime and thin as a whisper by August. And around that creek had grown a scatter of buildings that owed their existence entirely to the Silver Star Mining Company's stamp mill, which crushed ore around the clock and drank water from the creek the way a fevered man drinks broth. There was one road in and out of the district, climbing through a canyon that flooded in storms and iced in winter, and every soul in the camp knew that if the mill's water ever failed, or the road ever closed for good, Silver Creek would blow away like the tailings dust that already coated every windowsill in town. There was a mercantile, a saloon that also served as the closest thing the camp had to a hotel, a squat stone building that housed the Silver Creek Bank and Loan Trust, a livery, Theodore Boone's smithy at the northern edge of town where the road bent toward the canyon, and at the southern end, in a small frame house that had once belonged to Dr. Samuel Hart and now belonged, by law and by grief, to his widow. The surgery where Lydia Hart saw to whatever ailed the district when she was not driving her mule team out to farms and camps too far or too poor to come to her. She had not expected, riding into town that evening with mud dried gray on her skirts, to find Theodore Boone waiting at her gate. You beat me here, she said, drawing the mules up. I thought you had hinges to deliver. Delivered them an hour past. I came by to see that you made it in before dark since I talked you out of the low ford and into a longer road. He came forward to take Jasper's bridle without being asked, and this time she let him, too tired to argue the point. Also I brought you this. He held out a jar of liniment, plain and unlabeled. For your hands. Rope burns and mud crack a lady's skin worse than folks credit. My mother used to make it from tallow and pine pitch. I still make a batch every spring. Lydia took the jar, turning it over, absurdly touched by so small a kindness. You carry liniment around in your wagon on the chance of meeting a muddy doctor. I carry a great many things around on the chance of meeting somebody who needs them, Dr. Hart. It is mostly luck that today it was you. Mostly, she agreed, and found she was smiling, and found that she did not especially want him to leave. He did leave that evening, with a tip of his hat and a promise that he would see her hinges greased and her wagon wheels checked before she went out again. And Lydia stood at her gate long after his wagon had rattled off toward the smithy, turning the jar of liniment over in her muddy hands, and told herself this was nothing more than the ordinary kindness of a small town where everyone depended on everyone else, and knew, again, that this was not entirely true. The arrangement that grew up between them over the following weeks had no name, and both of them were careful to keep it that way. It began reasonably enough. Theodore Boone came by the surgery 2 days after the mud crossing to check the wheels and axles of Lydia's wagon, a task he insisted took no more than an hour, and which somehow stretched to an afternoon, filled with coffee on her porch, and a conversation about nothing in particular that neither of them wanted to end. He came again the following week when word reached him that she meant to drive out to the Whitfield farm, 11 miles up the canyon road, to see to old Ezra Whitfield's chest complaint, and he arrived at her gate at dawn with his own wagon hitched, insisting only that he had business at the Whitfield place himself regarding a plow blade that wanted mending, which might or might not have been strictly true. "You do not need to escort me every time I leave town, Mr. Boone," Lydia told him, not for the first time, as they climbed the canyon road together beneath a sky so blue and dry it seemed to promise the whole territory nothing but fair weather forever. "I am not escorting you. I have my own business." "You have remarkably convenient business, then, that always seems to fall on the same road and the same day as mine." "Silver Creek is a small district, Dr. Hart. There is only the one road. It would be stranger if our business did not fall together." He said it with such perfect innocence that she laughed despite herself, and let the matter drop, because in truth she had begun to look forward to the mornings when his wagon appeared at her gate, and she was not ready to examine why. It was on the road to the Whitfield place that she first saw him truly work, and it left an impression she did not soon shake. A wheel on a freight wagon ahead of them had come apart entirely, the iron tire sprung loose from the wood, and its teamster stood cursing over it with no notion of how to proceed. Theodore Boone climbed down, looked at the ruin for perhaps 10 seconds, and set to work with tools from his own wagon, heating the tire iron over a small fire built in the road itself, hammering it back to true against a flat rock, and refitting it to the wheel with a patience and precision that reminded Lydia, oddly, of her own work at a patient's bedside. He did not hurry. He did not waste a motion. When he was satisfied, he cooled the iron with water from a canteen, and the wheel was sound again, and the whole business had taken less than an hour. "You make it look simple," she said, as they drove on, the freight wagon rattling ahead of them now saved. "It is simple, once you know how iron wants to move. Same as I expect setting a bone looks simple to you and is a mystery to the rest of us. It is not so different, I suppose. Iron and bone both want to go back to their proper shape if you are patient and you do not force them." He glanced at her sideways, something warm in his eyes. "I like that. I like the way you think about things, Dr. Hart. You may call me Lydia, Mr. Boone, if we are to keep meeting on every road in the district. Then you had better call me Theodore, or this arrangement is going to look very peculiar to anyone watching us be so formal while sharing biscuits on a wagon seat." It was the first time either of them had used the word arrangement aloud, and they both heard it land, and neither of them corrected it, and something settled between them that afternoon that felt a good deal like the beginning of a promise, even though neither of them was prepared to call it that yet. At the Whitfield farm, Lydia set old Ezra's ribs, cracked from a fall off a hay wagon, and listened to his chest and pronounced him fit enough with rest, while Theodore mended the plow blade he had, in fact, genuinely come to mend, and Martha Whitfield fed them both a supper of beans and cornbread, and looked at the two of them with the particular knowing expression of an old woman who has seen a courtship take root long before the two people involved have noticed it themselves. "You two make a fine pair," Martha said, quite without preamble as she cleared the plates. "We are only neighbors helping neighbors, Mrs. Whitfield," Lydia said, perhaps too quickly. "Course you are, dear," Martha said, in a tone that made it clear she believed no such thing, and winked at Theodore, who had the grace to look embarrassed and said nothing at all. On the ride home in the last gold light of evening, Theodore broke a long, comfortable silence to say, "She is not wrong, you know, Martha Whitfield, about us making a fine pair." Lydia kept her eyes on the road, her heart beating a little faster than the pace of the mules warranted. "I have only known you a few weeks, Theodore." "I have known plenty of people my whole life, and thought less of them than I think of you after a few weeks." He said it simply, no pressure in it, the same steady honesty she had come to expect from him. "I do not mean to press you, Lydia. You buried a husband not 2 years past, and I know grief does not clear out of a heart on any particular schedule. I only mean to say that whatever this is between us, I am not sorry for it, and I do not intend to pretend I am, even if we both keep calling it neighborly and temporary." She was quiet a long moment, watching the canyon walls turn amber and then violet as the sun dropped behind them. "I do not want it to be temporary," she admitted finally, surprising herself with how easily the truth came once she let herself say it. "I have been alone in this district a long time, Theodore. I did not realize how alone until you started turning up at my gate with liniment and convenient business." He reached over without asking and took her hand where it rested on the wagon seat between them, and she let him, and they rode the last mile into Silver Creek that way, hand in hand in the fading light, saying nothing more because nothing more needed saying. The trouble began, as trouble in mining districts so often did, with a piece of paper. Theodore Boone had built his forge with his father's hands and his own, 12 years back, on land his father had purchased outright from the original townsite survey, and the smithy had never carried so much as $1 of debt in all the years Theodore had run it alone. It was, therefore, with genuine bewilderment rather than alarm that he opened the letter that arrived by the Tuesday stage, bearing the seal of the Silver Creek Bank and Loan Trust, informing him that he was in default on a note secured against his smithy property in the amount of $600, and that the note's holder intended to exercise the right of foreclosure within 30 days, unless the full sum, with accrued interest, was paid. "I have never signed a note with that bank in my life," Theodore said, standing in Lydia's surgery with the letter in his hand, his usually easy face gone hard and pale. "My father never signed one either. I would stake my life on it." Lydia took the letter and read it twice, her physician's mind, trained to notice what did not fit, already turning over the wording. "It says here the original note was executed in 1874 in your father's name and assigned to the current holder only recently. My father died in the winter of '77. If there was a note against this property, it would have come up in the settling of his estate. I handled that myself, Lydia, with Judge Caro presiding. There was no debt recorded against the smithy, none. Then someone has manufactured one." She said it plainly, the way she might diagnose a fever, and watched him absorb the accusation and find, in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her voice, an ally rather than a doubter. "Who is the current holder of the note, Theodore?" He looked back at the letter, and something cold moved behind his eyes. "It says the note was assigned 3 weeks past to the estate of Dr. Samuel Hart." The silence that followed was long enough that Lydia heard her own clock ticking on the mantel, and heard, too, the particular quiet of a moment in which two people realize together that the ground beneath their new and fragile trust has just shifted. "That is not possible," she said finally. "I administer my husband's estate myself. I would know if such a note existed." "Would you? All of it? Every paper?" She thought of the strongbox in her bedroom, inherited whole from Samuel's affairs, filled with receipts and correspondence and old ledgers she had never had cause to sort through line by line, grief having made the task unbearable in the early months and habit having postponed it ever since. "I do not know everything in that box, no," she admitted. "But I know I have never called in a debt against you, Theodore, and I never would, whether I held the paper or not. I believe you." He said it at once without hesitation, and something in her chest eased at how readily he offered his trust even with his livelihood hanging in the balance. "But somebody wants it to look otherwise, and I mean to find out who and why, because whoever forged my father's signature meant for this to land on you as much as on me. That is not accident, Lydia. That is design." They went together that same afternoon to the Silver Creek Bank and Loan Trust, where Silas Crane received them behind a desk of polished walnut that looked entirely out of place amid the raw pine and canvas of the rest of the camp, a testament to a man who had done very well for himself in a district where most people struggled for every dollar. "Mr. Boone, Dr. Hart." Crane rose with the smooth courtesy of a man who had built his fortune on being agreeable right up until the moment he was not. "I confess I expected this visit. A distressing matter, the note. I assure you the bank is merely the instrument here, not the author of your troubles." "There is no note," Theodore said flatly. "My father never borrowed against the smithy. I want to see the original document." Of course, of course." Crane produced, with theatrical readiness, a ledger book and a folded paper bearing a signature that did, Lydia had to admit, bear some resemblance to the elder Boone's hand, though something in the loop of the letters struck her as subtly wrong, too careful, too consistent, lacking the small variations she would expect in a man's natural signature. "This is not my father's signature," Theodore said, low and controlled, though she could hear the anger banked beneath it. "I have seen his hand on 100 documents. This is close, but it is not right. I am only the custodian of the paper, Mr. Boone, not its author. The note predates my tenure at this institution." Crane spread his hands, the picture of regretful helplessness. "As for the assignment to the Hart estate, that was executed at Dr. Hart's own request some years back, in settlement of certain medical debts I owed him. I am afraid the doctor kept his own counsel about such arrangements, as was his right." Lydia felt the ground tilt again. "My husband never mentioned any such arrangement to me. Perhaps he did not think it worth mentioning, given that the note was not yet in default. Circumstances change, Dr. Hart." Crane's smile did not reach his eyes. "I am afraid the law is the law. If Mr. Boone cannot produce proof of payment, the note stands, and the estate you administer holds a lawful claim to the smithy property." It was, Lydia understood in that moment, a trap built with considerable care, one that placed her, however unwillingly, on the opposite side of a ledger from the man she had begun to love, and left Theodore Boone's whole livelihood balanced on a piece of paper neither of them could yet prove false, though both of them were entirely certain that it was. They left the bank in a silence heavy with things unsaid, and it was not until they had walked the length of the main street and stood beneath the cottonwood outside Lydia's gate that either of them spoke. "I do not want this," Lydia said, her voice unsteady in a way it rarely was. "Theodore, I do not want your smithy. I would burn that paper myself before I would take one board of your forge from you. I know that." He took her hands, his grip warm and certain even as his jaw stayed tight with worry. "I know you, Lydia. I do not doubt you for one moment. But Crane has built himself a fine trap, has he not? If the note stands, either you foreclose and take a property you never wanted, or you refuse and open yourself to charges of mismanaging your husband's estate, which a man like Crane would surely find a way to use against you besides. He has made us enemies on paper so that we cannot easily be allies in fact. Then we had better prove the paper is a lie. That is exactly what I mean to do, but it will not be simple. If Crane forged one note, he has likely forged others and covered his tracks well." He looked at her, something fierce and warm in his eyes despite the trouble pressing on them both. "Will you help me, Lydia? Not because it is your husband's estate at stake, but because I would rather face this with you than face it alone." "I was going to help you whether you asked or not," she said, and meant it entirely. They began with the strongbox. It took 3 evenings of careful work, spread out across Lydia's kitchen table by lamplight, to sort through 5 years of Samuel Hart's correspondence and accounts. And it was slow, difficult work made harder by the fact that every letter in her late husband's hand stirred some small grief she had thought long settled. But Theodore sat with her through all of it, patient and steady, sometimes reading aloud so she did not have to, sometimes simply refilling her coffee and letting her work in silence when a particular letter struck too close to old wounds. And by the 3rd evening they had found what they were looking for. It was a single entry in Samuel Hart's own ledger, dated 1876, recording a payment of $40 received from Silas Crane for medical services rendered to Crane's late wife during her final illness, marked paid in full. There was no mention anywhere in 5 years of Samuel's careful records of any note, any assignment, any debt owed by Crane beyond that single small sum, long since settled. "There," Lydia said, her finger pressed hard against the page as though she could hold the truth still by force of touch. "My husband kept meticulous accounts, Theodore. He was a physician, not a banker, but he never let a debt go unrecorded, owed or owing. If there had been a $600 note transferred to this estate, it would be here. It is not here. Crane invented the whole transaction after Samuel's death, when there was no one left alive to contradict him." "That proves it to us," Theodore said carefully, "but will it prove it to a judge? Crane will simply say your husband kept the arrangement off the books, or that the paperwork was lost. We need something that shows the forgery itself, not just the absence of an honest record." It was Lydia who thought of Nathaniel Prout. Nate Prout was the junior clerk at the Silver Creek Bank and Loan Trust, a thin, anxious young man of perhaps 22 who had treated a bout of pneumonia under Lydia's care the previous winter, and had never quite stopped looking at her with the particular gratitude of a man who believes a doctor saved his life, which, in his case, was very likely true. Lydia found him at the Mercantile on a Sunday afternoon when the bank was closed, and Crane was known to be away at the mill office, and asked him, gently but directly, whether he had ever seen the original note against Theodore Boone's smithy before it appeared in Crane's ledger 3 weeks past. Nate Prout went pale and would not meet her eyes at first, twisting his hat in his hands, and Lydia recognized in him the particular fear of a young man caught between decency and his livelihood. "I could lose my position, Dr. Hart, if Mr. Crane learned I had spoken to you of bank business. I understand that fear better than you might think, Nate. I am asking you anyway, because a good man's forge and a good man's name are being stolen, and because I believe you are not the kind of man who can watch that happen and say nothing, or you would not look so troubled right now." He was quiet a long moment, and then, in a low rush, as though the words had been dammed up and were glad to break free, he told her what he knew. He had been in the back room of the bank 3 weeks past, cataloging old survey records, when he had seen Silas Crane at his desk with a bottle of ink and a stack of blank paper, practicing a signature over and over on scrap sheets before committing it, finally, to a formal document. He had thought little of it at the time, assuming Crane was drafting some ordinary contract, until the letter of default arrived at Boone's smithy and Nate recognized, with a sick lurch, the very document he had watched being born. "I kept one of the scrap sheets," Nate admitted. "I do not rightly know why. I suppose some part of me knew it was wrong even then and wanted a record of it in case it ever mattered. It is at my boarding house. I can bring it to you." "Bring it to Theodore Boone's smithy tomorrow evening after the bank closes," Lydia said. "And Nate, I am grateful to you, more grateful than I can easily say. You saved my life last winter, Dr. Hart. I have been waiting a year for a chance to do something in return." He managed a small, frightened smile. "I only wish it did not have to be quite so dangerous a something." It was dangerous, and it grew more dangerous within the day, because Silas Crane was not a fool, and a man who has built his fortune on careful manipulation of other men's ignorance does not remain ignorant himself of when he is being watched. Theodore came to Lydia's surgery the following evening, his face grim, carrying news that changed the shape of everything. "Crane has moved up the foreclosure date. The letter came this afternoon. He says irregularities in my payment history require immediate action, and he means to file the papers with the county recorder in Carson City by week's end, which would make the foreclosure final under territorial law before we could ever contest it in court here. Carson City is 2 days' ride," Lydia said, already calculating. "If he means to file by week's end, we have perhaps 3 days to reach the recorder first with proof enough to stop him. There is more." Theodore's jaw was tight. "Nate came to the smithy an hour ago, badly shaken. Crane confronted him this morning, accused him of disloyalty, dismissed him from the bank on the spot, and warned him that certain accidents befall young men who meddle in business too large for them. Nate is frightened for his safety, Lydia, and I do not think he is wrong to be. Where is he now?" "Hidden at the smithy in the back room where I keep the coal." He gave me the scrap sheet with Crane's practiced signature on it before he lost his nerve entirely and started talking about leaving the territory tonight. Lydia was already reaching for her medical bag and her coat. Then we do not have 3 days. We have tonight and tomorrow, and we had better not waste either. If Crane suspects we have evidence, he will not wait for a foreclosure deadline. He will find some way to destroy that scrap of paper and silence anyone who might testify to it. They rode out from Silver Creek before dawn the next morning, Theodore driving his sturdiest wagon with Nate Prout huddled in the back among coils of chain and iron stock, Lydia beside Theodore on the seat with her medical bag at her feet and the precious scrap of paper, along with Samuel's ledger, and a sworn statement from Nate that Lydia had witnessed and notarized herself the night before, wrapped in oilcloth against her chest like something sacred. The road to Carson City ran first through the canyon, the same dangerous miles Theodore had driven 1,000 times as a stage teamster, and then descended toward the broader valley where the territorial capital sat, and the whole journey under good conditions took a long day and part of a second. Conditions, that morning, were not good. Word had reached them at the last farm before the canyon mouth that heavy rain in the mountains 2 days past, far upstream of Silver Creek's own Fairweather, had swollen the Carson River until it ran high and violent over its banks, and that the plank crossing at Miller's Ford, the only reliable crossing for 20 miles in either direction, was reported still standing but under considerable strain. "We could wait for the water to drop," Theodore said, though his tone made clear he did not believe it a real option. "It would cost us a day, maybe 2. "We do not have a day, let alone 2, Lydia said. "Crane will file those papers the moment the recorder's office opens Thursday morning. If we are not there before him with proof in hand, Theodore, the law will side with the paper on file, whatever we bring afterward. We have to cross today." He looked at her for a long moment, weighing her resolve against the danger, and she watched him decide, the way she had watched him decide to fix a stranger's wheel and to pull a stubborn team out of the mud, that her judgment was sound and worth trusting even when the road ahead was frightening. "Then we cross today," he said. "But we cross careful, and we cross together." Miller's Ford, when they reached it in the middle afternoon, was a sight that tightened Lydia's stomach even as her physician's mind noted with clinical detachment the details that mattered for survival. A plank bridge some 40 feet across, lashed together with rope and iron spikes over a river running brown and furious, 6 feet higher than its ordinary channel, carrying whole branches, and once, sickeningly, the bloated carcass of some drowned animal past the bridge's straining pilings. The bridge groaned audibly even as they watched, one plank near the center already sprung loose at one end and hanging by a single spike, water sheeting up over the deck with every surge of the current. "That bridge will not hold a loaded wagon," Theodore said, "not with the water still rising." "It has to hold long enough for the 3 of us in this paper," Lydia said. They agreed, after a hurried and tense discussion, to leave the wagon and horses on the near bank, to cross on foot with only what they could carry, and to send for the wagon later once the water dropped. Theodore uncoiled the same heavy rope he had used to pull Lydia's wheel from the mud weeks before, and this time he used it to lash the 3 of them together, himself in front, Lydia in the middle with the oilcloth packet bound tight beneath her coat, and Nate Prout, white-faced and trembling, bringing up the rear. "Test each plank before you trust your weight to it," Theodore called back over the roar of the water, already stepping out onto the bridge with the careful, deliberate gait of a man who had crossed 100 uncertain surfaces in his years driving freight through this canyon. "Keep your hand on the rope rail. If a plank gives, do not fight it, just hold the rope and let it take your weight." They were perhaps a third of the way across when the first plank gave way beneath Nate Prout's boot with a crack like a gunshot, and he went down hard, one leg punching through into the churning water below, held only by the rope binding him to Lydia and through her to Theodore. Lydia threw herself flat against the remaining planks and hauled on the rope with every ounce of strength she had, screaming his name over the water's roar, and Theodore was already scrambling back toward them, bracing himself against the bridge's swaying rail. "I have got him," Theodore shouted. "Lydia, hold the rope, do not let go, I am coming." Nate's face, when Theodore hauled him up out of the current, was a mask of terror, blood running from a gash on his cheek, where he had struck a plank on the way down. His leg twisted at an angle that made Lydia's stomach clench with dread even before she reached him. "It is broken," she said, running her hands quickly over his shin, her voice steady even though her heart was hammering. "The bone has not come through the skin. We can splint it once we are across, but we cannot linger here. The bridge is failing under us." As if in answer, a second plank tore free somewhere behind them and vanished into the flood with a splash lost immediately in the river's roar, and the whole structure gave a long, groaning shudder that told all three of them the bridge did not intend to stand much longer. "Theodore," Lydia said, "we cannot carry him and keep our footing both, not on planks this uncertain." "Then I will carry him, and you go ahead of me and test the planks and call back what is safe." He was already lifting Nate across his shoulders, the younger man crying out at the movement despite Lydia's quick warning to hold still. And Lydia understood, in that moment, that Theodore Boone meant to cross a collapsing bridge over a flooded river with another man's full weight on his back, trusting his footing to her eyes and her voice alone, because there was no other way across. And because he would not leave Nate Prout to drown any more than he had been willing to leave Lydia stranded in the mud weeks before. "Step where I step," she said, forcing her voice to stay level even as fear clawed at her throat. "There, that plank, it held my weight, it will hold yours. Now here, careful, there is a gap, step wide." They went that way, plank by plank, Lydia testing and calling, Theodore following with Nate's weight bent across his shoulders and sweat running into his eyes despite the cold spray drenching them all. The rope between them the only thing keeping any one of them from being swept away should a plank give entirely. Twice more the bridge shed pieces of itself into the flood behind them, each loss shortening their retreat and leaving them no choice but forward. And once Lydia's own foot slipped on a plank slick with spray, and she went down hard on one knee, catching herself on the rope rail with a cry that Theodore answered instantly, calling her name with such raw fear in his voice that she understood, even in the midst of danger, exactly how much she had come to mean to him. "I am well," she called back, hauling herself up, her knee screaming but bearing weight. "Keep coming, we are almost across." The last 10 feet were the worst, the planks there soaked through and slick, the bank ahead tantalizingly close, and it was only through Theodore's raw strength and Lydia's steady guidance that they made it, stumbling up onto solid mud on the far bank just as, behind them, the center span of the bridge tore free entirely and was carried away downstream in a tangle of splintered wood and rope, the crossing gone as though it had never existed. For a long moment none of them spoke. All three collapsed on the muddy bank, chests heaving, soaked to the skin, alive. "We are across," Nate said finally, in a voice hoarse with pain and disbelief. "We are actually across." Theodore looked at Lydia, water running from his hair down a face gone pale with exertion, and something passed between them that was more than relief, something that felt like the recognition of a debt that could never quite be repaid in ordinary terms, because each of them had, in the space of that crossing, trusted the other with their very life and been answered with everything they had to give. "You did not let go of that rope," he said quietly, "even when you went down. Neither did you." She reached over and took his hand, both of them shaking with cold and spent adrenaline, and for once neither of them tried to make the moment smaller than it was. "We are not losing each other today, Theodore Boone, not to a river and not to Sela's crane either." They splinted Nate's leg with sticks and strips torn from Lydia's petticoat, and made a rough travois from Theodore's coat and 2 fallen branches, and the 2 of them dragged and carried the young clerk the final 6 miles into Carson City on foot, arriving footsore and filthy and utterly determined, just as the sun was setting on a day that had asked more of all three of them than any of them had thought they had to give. The county recorder's office did not open again until Thursday morning, and it was there, in a plain government room smelling of dust and old paper, that they laid before the recorder, and at Lydia's insistence, before a circuit judge who happened to be in town for other business, the whole of their evidence. Samuel Hart's ledger showing Crane's debt paid in full years before any note could have existed, Nate Pruitt's sworn statement given from a cot where he lay with his splinted leg, propped on a folded blanket, and the scrap of paper bearing Silas Crane's own hand practicing, over and over, the signature he would later forge onto a dead man's note. Judge Caro, who had presided over the settling of Elias Boone's estate 2 years before, and remembered clearly that no debt against the smithy had been recorded then, examined the evidence with the slow, careful attention of a man who had seen enough frontier fraud in his years on the circuit to know exactly what he was looking at. "This is a forged instrument," he said finally, setting the disputed note down on his desk with something like contempt in the gesture, "and a fraudulent assignment besides. I will not record any foreclosure based on this paper, Mr. Boone, and I intend to see Mr. Crane answer for it, both in this matter and in whatever others may come to light once word of this spreads. Fraud of this kind is rarely a man's only sin. It was not, as it turned out, Crane's only sin." Word traveled fast once the story broke, first to the sheriff's office in Silver Creek and then through the whole district. And within a week 3 more families came forward with notes and mortgages bearing the same careful, practiced forgeries. The Whitfield Farms water rights, quietly transferred the year before under a manufactured default, a small claim belonging to a Chinese laundryman named Wei Chen, whose modest savings Crane had nearly succeeded in seizing entirely under a fabricated debt, and a parcel of land near the mill that Crane had apparently been maneuvering for years to control outright, hoping to hold the district's water supply hostage to his own enrichment. Sheriff Wyatt Doyle rode out to arrest Silas Crane on a bright, ordinary Tuesday morning, and Crane, when confronted in his own bank with the sheriff and a deputy and half the ruined families of Silver Creek watching from the boardwalk outside, did not go quietly. He drew a small pistol from his desk drawer, more out of panic than any real intent to use it well, and there was a tense, ugly minute in which Theodore Boone, who had come to witness the arrest, stepped forward without hesitation and knocked the weapon from Crane's hand with the same quick, sure movements he used to catch a falling hammer. Before the deputy wrestled Crane to the floor, and the whole sordid business ended not in violence, but in the deeply unglamorous sound of a grown man weeping and cursing, as he was led away in irons to await trial in Carson City. "That was foolish," Lydia told Theodore that evening, only half scolding, examining a small bruise on his knuckles by lamplight in her surgery. "You might have been shot." "He was shaking so badly he could not have hit the side of the bank," Theodore said, though he did not argue when she pressed liniment into the bruise, the same liniment, she noted with a small smile, that had first passed between them weeks before. "I was not going to stand there and let him hurt anyone else, Lydia, not after everything he had already taken." "No," she agreed softly, "I do not suppose you would." With Crane's fraud exposed and the false note thrown out by Judge Caro's own order, Theodore's smithy was safe, the Whitfield Farms water rights restored, and Wei Chen's savings returned to him with the county's formal apology, though everyone in Silver Creek understood that no apology could fully repay a year of terror and near ruin. The mining company, eager to distance itself from any suggestion of complicity in Crane's schemes, offered a reward of $500 each to Theodore Boone and Lydia Hart for their part in uncovering the fraud, a sum that would have been, for either of them, a considerable fortune. They discussed it on Lydia's porch on a warm evening 2 weeks after Crane's arrest, the district settling back into its ordinary rhythms, the creek running clear and bright, the the mill's stamps thudding their steady, unbroken rhythm in the distance. "I do not want it," Theodore said, turning the mining company's letter over in his hands. "It feels like being paid for doing the only decent thing a person could have done." "I feel the same," Lydia admitted. "But $500 each is a great deal to simply refuse outright, Theodore. There must be some good use for it, even if neither of us wants it in our own pocket." They talked long into that evening, and by the time the stars had come out fully over the canyon, they had settled on a plan that satisfied them both. The combined $1,000, along with a further sum Theodore insisted on adding from his own savings, would go toward building Silver Creek a proper doctor's office and a small infirmary with real beds, so that Lydia would no longer need to see patients from a spare room in a house built for a husband who was gone, and so that some future physician, should Lydia ever wish for help or ever wish to rest, would find a real practice waiting rather than an empty promise. The remainder would go toward rebuilding Miller's Ford with a proper iron truss bridge rather than lashed planks, so that no one crossing that river again would have to trust their life to rope and luck the way the three of them had. "A hospital and a bridge," Theodore said, testing the words. "Not a bad legacy for a stubborn mule team and a fool blacksmith who would not leave a lady stranded in the mud." "It was not foolish," Lydia said. "It was the finest thing anyone had done for me in a very long time, Theodore Boone, and I have not forgotten it, and I do not intend to." He turned to look at her then, the lamplight from her window falling soft across his face, and something in his expression had shed all its careful restraint. "Lydia, I have been dancing around temporary arrangements and convenient business for 2 months now, and I am tired of pretending either of us believes a word of it. I do not want to be your neighbor who happens to travel the same roads. I want to be the man you come home to and the man who comes home to you. I love you. I think I have loved you since you told that mule to move, and it very nearly listened." Lydia laughed, though her eyes were bright with sudden tears, and she reached up to touch his face, weathered and kind and utterly familiar to her now in a way that felt like coming home. "I love you too, Theodore. I have loved you since you pulled my wheel free sideways instead of forward and told me I had only been short on tools, not short on sense. I did not know then how much I needed to hear someone say that to me." He kissed her then, gently at first and then not gently at all, and she met him with all the certainty of a woman who had spent a year and a half being strong for everyone else, and had finally found someone strong enough to be strong beside her instead of her. When they finally drew apart, both of them a little breathless, he rested his forehead against hers and said, low and rough, "Marry me, Lydia. Not because a bridge collapsed under us or because we outwitted a thief together, though I will be glad to tell our grandchildren those stories someday. Marry me because I cannot picture a single sunrise from here on that I do not want to share with you." "Yes," she said without an instant's hesitation, surprising herself with how simple it felt to say after so many months of careful independence. "Yes, Theodore, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in the half-finished new infirmary, its bones raised but its walls not yet closed in, so that the whole ceremony took place beneath open sky with the mountains standing gold and violet in the evening light. The entire district turned out to witness it. The Whitfields, restored to their farm, Wei Chen, who had insisted on providing lanterns strung through the rafters, Nate Prout, walking now with only a slight limp and a job at the new county recorder's office in Carson City, secured on the strength of his honesty, Sheriff Doyle, standing witness with visible pride, and half of Silver Creek besides, drawn by gratitude and genuine affection for the two people who had between them saved the district's water, its land, and more than a few of its people's futures. That night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns had burned low, Theodore Boone and Lydia Hart stood together in the small house behind the smithy that would now be their shared home, and there was no more pretending left to do, no more careful words about temporary arrangements or convenient business. There was only the quiet certainty of two people who had crossed mud and fraud and a collapsing bridge together and found, at the far end of all of it, exactly what they had each been missing without knowing its name. He undressed her slowly, reverently, murmuring her name against her skin like a vow renewed, and she pulled him close with the same sure hands that had guided him across a failing bridge. And they came together that night not out of desperation or danger, but out of choice, freely made and long since earned. Two lonely people who had found, at last, in each other, the safest place either of them had ever known. In the years that followed, Silver Creek's little infirmary became known through the whole district as a place where the sick were never turned away, and the poor were never charged more than they could afford. And the Iron Truss Bridge at Miller's Ford stood solid through every spring flood that came after, a monument neither of its builders had wanted, but both of them were quietly proud of. Lydia Hart, who kept her own name in her medical practice out of respect for the husband who had first brought her west, was known throughout the territory as the finest physician for 100 miles, and Theodore Boone's forge rang from dawn to dusk with the steady, honest work of a man who had never once regretted refusing to leave a stubborn widow stranded in the mud. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done, the two of them could often be found together on the porch of their little house, her hand in his, watching the sun go down gold and easy over a canyon road that had once nearly cost them everything, and had instead given them, against every hard beginning, exactly the life they had never quite let themselves hope for.